The men of Redemption Gulch had a special kind of cruelty, the kind reserved for women they couldn't own and secrets they couldn't keep. My name is Serafina Hayes, and my secret was a barren womb, an emptiness that echoed louder than the drunken shouts in Bartholomew's saloon. In a town where a woman's worth was measured in sons, I was worthless. So when my husband's debts climbed higher than the jagged peaks surrounding our miserable lives, they cooked up a punishment that was also their sickest joke. They sent me, the infertile bride, into the wastes, a so-called peace offering for a wounded Apache warrior they wanted gone. They expected the desert to swallow me whole. They never ever imagined I'd come back, and they sure as hell never imagined I'd be carrying a child. The red dust of that town was a fine powder that got into everything. It settled on the windowsills, clung to your clothes, and worked its way deep into your soul until you felt as parched and desolate as the land itself. For 3 years, I'd been the wife of Samuel Hayes, a man made of hopeful sunrises and disastrous sunsets. He'd come west dreaming of silver, but his hands were better at holding a whiskey glass than a pickaxe. His charm, which had once felt like the sun on my skin, had curdled into the desperate whine of a beaten dog. His debts to Bartholomew Kane were a thick chain around both our necks. Kane wasn't just a man. He was the town's owner. He owned the saloon, the store, and the mortgage on damn near every person in that gulch. His smile was a flash of a gold tooth and pure malice. He could look at you and tally up your weaknesses like you were a column of figures in his ledger. And my biggest figure, my only figure, was the silent, empty cradle in my soul. Barren. The word followed me like a stray dog. They spat it like tobacco juice. The other wives, their aprons pulled tight over their swelling bellies, would offer me a kind of pity that felt more like poison. Their eyes held a grim satisfaction in their own fertility, a smugness that was sharper than any knife. They'd talk of prayers and special tonics, but it was all a show, a way to remind me of what I wasn't. Samuel never blamed me, not with his words, but I saw it in the slump of his shoulders when another man's son ran past. I saw it in the way his eyes would slide away from mine, in the suffocating quiet of our bed. That silence was a living thing in our cabin. It was the ghost of lullabies never sung. The joke, like all cruelties in Redemption Gulch, started in Kane's saloon. The air was thick with stale beer and desperation. Kane had summoned Samuel. I waited in the cabin, mending a shirt, the rhythmic stab of the needle doing nothing to quiet the frantic drumming in my chest. He came back late, stumbling, smelling of cheap whiskey and pure terror. He wouldn't look at me. "What is it, Samuel?" I asked, my voice a thread. He collapsed into a chair. "Kane, he made an offer." That was the first lie. Bartholomew Kane didn't make offers. He issued decrees. He owned us. "He'll wipe the slate clean," Samuel mumbled into his hands. "All of it, every last cent." A cold snake coiled in my stomach. Kane's generosity was always bait on a hook. "For what?" I whispered. He finally looked up, his face a miserable mask of shame and a disgusting sliver of relief. "There's a native," he started, his voice cracking. "Up in the Crimson Canyons, wounded. The ranchers say he's been scaring the cattle." I waited, my blood turning to ice. I knew how these men thought. They saw the native people as obstacles, ghosts to be exorcised from the land they were stealing. "The men want to ride up there and finish him," Samuel choked out. "But Kane says that's messy, bad for business. He says, a gesture of peace is better." He couldn't say it. He couldn't speak the words. The joke was taking its final, monstrous shape in the shadows of our cabin. "What gesture?" I pressed, my own voice like stone. "They want to send a woman," he finally said, the words tearing from his throat. "A peace offering. A bride," he called it. Then his eyes, swimming with pathetic tears, locked onto mine. "He wants to send you, Serafina." The air rushed out of my lungs. It wasn't a peace offering. It was a death sentence, gift wrapped in mockery. They would send the barren woman, the useless wife, to a man they believed was already knocking on death's door. A perfect, clean solution. If the warrior killed me, well, then the town had its excuse to ride up and slaughter him. Justified. If I died of thirst or heat in the wastes, it was one less mouth to feed and a debt cleared from the books. And if by some impossible, twisted miracle, the warrior accepted this bride, it was the greatest joke of all. The infertile woman given to the last remnant of a dying race. The punchline was my life. You agreed, I said. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. Sarah, what choice did I have? He pleaded, his voice rising into a pathetic wail. He would have ruined us, taken everything. This way, we have a chance. The word we was like acid on my tongue. There is no we in this, Samuel. You have a chance to be free of your debts and your barren wife in one neat, tidy transaction. Useless tears streamed down his face. They'll give you a horse, he sobbed, some water, food. You just go. That was all. I was to be traded like a worn-out mule. My entire life, the currency for my husband's failures. The scorn of the town, which had been 1,000 stinging nettles, now coalesced into a single brutal blow. I looked at the man I had married, the boy who had promised to protect me, and I saw a stranger, a coward who would sacrifice me to save his own skin. In that moment, something inside me shattered. But in the space where it broke, something else began to form. Something hard and cold and sharp as ice. I would not give them the satisfaction of my tears. I would not let them see me crumble. Fine, I said, my voice so calm it scared even me. Tell Mr. Kane his offer is accepted. Samuel stared, his jaw hanging open. He'd expected hysterics, begging. He hadn't expected this chilling, final surrender that felt, strangely, like a victory. The next morning was a spectacle. The whole town gathered to watch me leave. Bartholomew Kane stood on the saloon porch, that gold tooth glinting in the sun, a smug grin plastered on his face. He gave a grand speech about forging peace, about the compassion of their community. The words were a vile joke, and everyone there was in on it. The men smirked. The women watched with that morbid curiosity, their faces a mix of pity and profound relief that it wasn't them. They gave me a sway-backed mare named Bess, a single water skin, a loaf of stale bread, and a strip of dried beef, just enough to maintain the pretense of charity. As I mounted the horse, my movements stiff, Kane stepped forward. You bring him peace, Mrs. Hayes, he said, his voice loud enough for the whole town to hear. Show him the gentle heart of civilization. I looked down at him, my gaze level and empty. For the first time, I think he saw past the barren wife. He saw a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose, and he saw just for a second that this made me the most dangerous person in the entire territory. I didn't look at Samuel. I couldn't. I just turned Bess's head west, toward the jagged red teeth of the canyons, and rode out of Redemption Gulch without a single backward glance. They thought they were sending me to my death. They thought they were writing the end of my story. But a story doesn't always end the way its authors intend. Sometimes the character starts writing it for herself. The sun was a hammer, beating down on a brass anvil of a sky. Within an hour, Redemption Gulch was just a smudge on the horizon, a bad memory easily erased by the shimmering heat. The world became a vast, terrifying silence of rock and sand. The only sounds were Bess's plodding hooves, the creak of old leather, and the dry rasp of my own breath. They'd pointed me toward Painted Rock Gorge, a place the townspeople whispered about, a place of spirits and bad medicine. It was the perfect place to dump someone you wanted to forget. By midday, the water was warm and tasted like animal hide. The bread was a rock in my gut. Fear was a cold knot in my stomach that the sun couldn't touch. Every shadow, every circling hawk sent a jolt of terror through me. I was a town woman, used to walls. Out here, I was just prey. I imagined snakes coiled under rocks, mountain lions with eyes like yellow lamps, and him, the man I was being sent to. They called him a beast, a red devil. In my mind, he was a monster waiting with a bloody knife. I was a lamb being delivered right to the slaughter. By the second day, a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical ache set in. My life, once defined by my failures as a wife, was now defined by nothing but the struggle to draw one more breath. On the evening of the third day, I found it. The gorge was a deep wound in the earth, a slash of shadow and color. A thin trickle of water led me down a treacherous path, At the bottom, a small, clear pool collected under an ancient cottonwood tree. An oasis. I slid off Bess, my legs buckling, and plunged my face into the cool, blessed water. I drank until my stomach hurt, and that's when I saw him. He was propped against the far wall of the gorge, so still I'd mistaken him for a shadow. He wasn't the monster of my nightmares. He was just a man. Gaunt, his dark hair matted with dirt, his buckskin leggings torn. One leg was stretched out before him at a sickeningly wrong angle, crudely splinted. A dark, ugly stain of dried blood covered his thigh. His face was a mask of pain, but his eyes were alive. They were dark and piercing, and they watched my every move with a weary, unnerving intensity. He held a knife, but his grip was weak. He was dying. All my fear crystallized into a single sharp point. This was him, the savage, the punchline. But looking at him, huddled in the dirt, racked with fever, I saw something else. I saw a human being at the absolute end of his rope. I saw a suffering that mirrored my own. We were two castaways, left to perish in the same forsaken place. The men of Redemption Gulch expected me to scream. They expected me to run. They expected weakness. And as I stood there trembling, a strange new feeling began to bloom in my chest. Defiance. My story was supposed to be over. But here, in this gorge, with this dying man, there was no one left to write the next page but me. My compassion, an emotion I thought had withered and died years ago, stirred. It was a foolish, dangerous feeling. The sensible thing to do was leave him. It was what was expected. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. His eyes narrowed. His knuckles whitened on the hilt of his knife. I stopped. I slowly unslung the water skin from my shoulder. Holding it out, I took another step. Slow, unthreatening. I wasn't a bride. I wasn't a peace offering. I was just a woman, offering water to a man dying of thirst. I set the water skin on the ground between us and backed away. I sat on a rock and watched him. For a long time, he just stared, trying to read me. The sun dipped below the canyon rim, plunging us into a cool purple twilight. Finally, with a pained grunt, he reached out a trembling hand and dragged the water skin toward him. He fumbled with the stopper, then drank. Slowly at first, then deeply, the water spilling down his chin. When he was done, he let his head fall back against the rock, his eyes closing for a moment. In that small act, a silent transaction had occurred. I had not been given. I had chosen to give. He had not taken. He had accepted. The joke had been refused. In the profound silence of Painted Rock Gorge, a new uncertain story had just begun. The days that followed passed in a slow rhythm of silent observation. We were two islands of pain, separated by a gulf of language and fear. I called him Kale in my mind, a name from nowhere, just a placeholder for the man whose real name I couldn't ask. His fever was a raging fire. During the day, he'd lie still, his breath shallow. At night, a deep chill would set in, and he would tremble so violently his teeth chattered. I kept a small fire between us, a barrier as much as a comfort. I was terrified of him, but a strange sense of responsibility had taken root. I had offered him water. That choice had tied my fate to his. His leg was the source of the poison. The flesh around the deep wound was swollen and an angry purple red. Without help, he would die. I had no medical training, just the common sense of a frontier woman. Wounds needed cleaning. Fevers needed breaking. The thought of touching him, of causing him more pain, was terrifying. But the thought of watching him die slowly was worse. On the fourth day, I made my decision. I boiled water in my tin cup over the fire and tore a strip from my petticoat, the last remnant of my old life. He was awake, his dark eyes following my every move. As I approached, he tried to push himself up, his hand instinctively going for his knife. "I want to help," I said, my voice hoarse. The words meant nothing to him, but I hoped the tone would. He stared, assessing me. He was weak. I could easily kill him. He had every reason to see me as the enemy. I took another slow step and knelt beside him. I deliberately placed my own small knife on the ground, well out of my reach. An act of trust, a disarmament. His eyes flickered from my face to my knife and back again. A long, tense moment stretched. Then with a slow exhale, he relaxed his grip on his own weapon and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Permission. My hands trembled as I reached for his leg. The heat radiating from the wound was intense. I gently untied the leather thongs of the crude splint. As I removed it, he let out a sharp hiss of pain, his body going rigid. But he didn't cry out. The injury was worse than I'd imagined. The bone was shattered, the gash filled with dirt. For the next hour I worked, cleaning the wound as best I could with the hot cloth, my stomach churning. He remained silent, his jaw clenched tight, his stoicism both terrifying and admirable. When I was done, I remembered my grandmother using poultices of yarrow and plantain. I searched the sparse vegetation, praying I'd find the right plants. I chewed the leaves into a crude paste and applied it to the wound, then bound it with fresh strips from my petticoat. I found two straight, sturdy branches and resplinted his leg, making it as immobile as I could. The work left me exhausted, drained. I had crossed a threshold. I had touched him, bound myself to his fate. A routine formed. I changed his dressing, foraged for food, tended the fire. Slowly the fever began to recede. The angry redness lessened. My crude medicine was working. We started to communicate without words. A nod was thanks. A gesture to the sky was the sun. He taught me which berries were safe, which roots to dig. He showed me how to make a simple snare. And when I caught a scrawny rabbit, he showed me how to skin and cook it. We shared the first real meat either of us had eaten in days. I learned to read the lines of pain around his eyes. He learned to read the despair in my own. We were both marked by scars. His were on his skin. Mine were on my soul. In that canyon, our shared brokenness became a language. We weren't just a white woman and a native man. We were Serafina and Kale, two survivors. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, he spoke. Why? The word was English, spoken with an accent, but perfectly clear. I looked up, startled. Why? He repeated, gesturing toward his bandaged leg. Your people, they did this. How could I explain? How could I tell him about the joke, about my own exile? They sent me here, I said quietly. They do not value me. He considered this for a long moment, his dark eyes seeing right through me to the barren, bruised places inside. He looked at my worn dress, my calloused hands, the weariness in my bones. He nodded slowly. I see, he said. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my marrow, that he did. He understood what it meant to be cast out. That quiet understanding forged a bond stronger than any shared language. In the heart of that lonely gorge, I had found not a savage, but the first person who had ever truly seen me. The brutal summer heat softened into the crisp gold of autumn. Kale's leg was healing, knitting itself into a new scar. His strength returned. He began to teach me things. How to chip flint for a sharper knife. How to read the clouds for rain. His hands, though still thin, were sure and deft. I was the student now. Our conversations were sparse, but we filled the gaps with gestures and a growing, instinctual understanding. He told me, with words and drawings in the sand, that his people were gone. He drew men on horses, fire and smoke, and then a brutal line drawn through them all. He was the only one left, a man without a tribe. I told him about Samuel, the debt, the town's cruel joke about my barrenness. I spoke the word barren aloud, and though he didn't know its meaning, he understood the pain it carried. He didn't offer pity. He offered his quiet, validating presence, which was worth so much more. Life settled into a peaceful routine. The gnawing fear that had defined my first days was replaced by a quiet competence. I was leaner, harder. The soft, useless woman from Redemption Gulch was gone. I had been scoured down to my essential self and found I wasn't so fragile after all. One morning, a strange sound carried on the wind, a faint, rhythmic creaking. Kale heard it first. He stiffened, his eyes scanning the canyon rim. Wagon wheels. A wagon meant people. It meant the world was about to intrude on our sanctuary. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. Kale grabbed his knife. He gestured for me to hide in the shadows of the rock overhang. We waited. The sound grew louder, coming from the west. Then we heard shouts. A gunshot, sharp and violent, echoed through the canyon. Another, a splintering crash, and then a terrible, chilling silence. We stayed hidden for hours. Finally, Cale decided we had to investigate. The possibility of hostiles was a grave danger, but the possibility of supplies, food, tools, a weapon, was too great to ignore. He moved with surprising speed on his crutch, and I followed, my heart pounding. The climb out was arduous. When we pulled ourselves over the rim, the sight made me gasp. It was a small homesteader's wagon, one wheel shattered. Two mules lay dead in their traces. The bodies of a man and a woman were sprawled in the dust nearby. They'd been shot. Arrows bristled from the man's chest. It was a raid. The wagon had been ransacked, its contents strewn across the ground. Sacks of flour torn open, clothes scattered, a broken mirror glinting in the sun. Cale knelt, examining the tracks. The arrows. "Not my people," he said, his voice a low growl. "Raiders, outcasts." A profound sadness washed over me. Another family, come west with dreams, extinguished in a flash of pointless violence. As Cale searched for anything salvageable, I heard it. A tiny mewing cry, almost lost in the whisper of the wind. I froze. "Cale," I whispered, "did you hear that?" The cry came again, thin and weak, from the back of the wrecked wagon. I scrambled over the debris, my hands trembling as I pulled back a heavy canvas tarp. There, nestled in a small wooden crate padded with blankets, was a baby. It couldn't have been more than a few months old, its face red and blotchy from crying. It was wrapped in a clean linen cloth, miraculously untouched by the chaos. I stared, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. A baby, a living, breathing child in the midst of all this death. Without thinking, I reached down and lifted the infant into my arms. It was so light, so fragile. As I held it close, its cries quieted. It snuggled against my chest, seeking warmth. A feeling I had buried long ago, a deep primal ache, surged through me with the force of a physical blow. The ghost of 1,000 unanswered prayers, my arms, always so empty, were suddenly, miraculously full. Tears streamed down my face, not of sorrow for the dead, but of an overwhelming, unnameable joy for the living child in my arms. Cale came to stand beside me, his stoic face softened with a profound sadness. He looked from the child to its dead parents, and then to me. He saw the look on my face, the fierce, protective way I held the infant. "We cannot leave it," I whispered, my voice thick with tears. He nodded slowly. "No, we cannot." We buried the parents, a grim, silent task under a pile of stones. We salvaged what we could, a water barrel, cornmeal, an axe, and the baby's crate. Inside were a few cloth diapers, a small tin of milk powder, and a silver locket. I opened it. On one side was a tiny painted portrait of the woman, on the other a single engraved name, Rowan. We took the child, Rowan, back down into the sanctuary of our gorge. That night, as I sat by the fire, feeding the baby a thin gruel of cornmeal and water from my fingertips, something shifted inside me. The barren woman was gone. The joke was over. I was no longer defined by my emptiness. I was defined by the small warm weight in my arms, by the tiny mouth that searched for sustenance, by the absolute fierce certainty that I would protect this child with my life. Cale watched us from across the fire. He saw the transformation. He had seen me as a discarded, frightened creature. Now he saw a mother. I had been sent into the wilderness as a punishment for being unable to bear a child, and the wilderness had given me one, not from my body but from my soul. Bartholomew Kane thought he had written me out of the story. He had no idea I was just beginning to write my own. But as I held that child, a small, leather-bound book I'd found tucked into the blankets of his crate felt heavy in my satchel. I hadn't looked at it yet. I was too afraid of what other secrets this tragedy held. The arrival of Rowan turned our quiet canyon into a home. Our days were now dictated by his needs. My hands, once raw from foraging, learned a new gentleness as I bathed him, changed him, and rocked him to sleep under the vast starry sky. The hollow space in my heart was filled with a fierce, boundless love for this child. He was not of my blood, but he was of my heart. Kale, too, was transformed. The grim survivor revealed a tenderness I never would have expected. He carved small, smooth wooden toys for Rowan, a bird, a horse. He would watch me sing the old lullabies my mother had sung to me, his expression soft. We were a strange, unlikely family, forged in tragedy and bound by the needs of an innocent child. But we knew our time in the gorge was limited. The cornmeal wouldn't last forever, and winter was coming. We needed supplies. We needed a plan. The thought of Redemption Gulch filled me with dread, but it was the only town for 100 miles. I will go, I told Cale one evening. No, he said, not looking up from the arrow he was fletching. It is not safe for you. It's not safe for you either, I countered. They see you, they'll shoot. They see me, they'll just be shocked. I took a deep breath. I have to face them, Cale. For Rowan. I won't spend my life hiding. He saw the resolve in my eyes and nodded. We will go together, to the edge of the town. I will wait. What we didn't know was that our story had already traveled back to that wretched town. A lone trapper had seen smoke rising from our gorge. He'd crept close enough to see a woman with sun-streaked hair, a native man, and a baby. The news hit Redemption Gulch like a lightning strike. The Baron Mrs. Hayes wasn't dead. She was alive, living with the savage. And impossibly, she had a child. Samuel, my husband, was shock sober from his months-long alcoholic haze, filled with a toxic mix of shame and jealousy. Bartholomew Kane was furious. His perfect, cruel joke had unraveled in the most spectacular way. The woman he had discarded was now a legend. He put on a show of outrage in his saloon. She's been tainted, he boomed, living with that redskin. And that child, it's an abomination. The town was divided. But while his cronies echoed his outrage, others, the quiet ones who had lived under Kane's thumb for years, felt a flicker of hope. The woman they had pitied had become something to be reckoned with. We, of course, knew nothing of this. As we prepared for our journey, I finally found the courage to open the small leather book I'd found in Rowan's crate. It was his mother's journal. I read it by the firelight, my blood turning to ice. The family, the Pattersons, weren't just passing through. They were fleeing Redemption Gulch. The journal described how Bartholomew Kane had been trying to force them off their land. Their homestead had the only reliable spring for miles, a secret they had tried to keep. Kane wanted it. He needed it to control the whole valley. The journal detailed threats, intimidation, midnight visits from Kane's thugs. And then, the final terrifying entry, written the morning they were killed. Kane was here last night. He said if we aren't gone by dawn, he's sending his riders with no tribe to solve his problem for good. We have to leave. God help us. The arrows. The raiders. It wasn't random. It was a hit. An execution. Bartholomew Kane, the pillar of that community, was a murderer. He had orphaned the child I now held in my arms. My mission had changed. I wasn't going back for flour and salt. I was going back for justice. I looked at Cale, the journal in my trembling hand. He killed them, I whispered. Kane killed Rowan's parents. Cale's face became a mask of stone. The fight was no longer just mine. It was his too. We left at dawn. I carried Rowan strapped to my chest. Cale walked beside me, his limp barely noticeable, a bow in his hand. As we crested the last rise and saw the dusty sprawl of Redemption Gulch below, I took a deep breath. I had left this town as a victim, a joke. I was returning as a survivor, a mother, and an executioner. I will wait in the rocks north of the creek, Cale said, his voice low. If you are not back by sundown, I am coming. I nodded, my throat tight. I wasn't the woman they sent away, not anymore. I squared my shoulders and started the long walk down into the hornet's nest. Walking into Redemption Gulch was like stepping back into a nightmare. But I was different. The sun and wind had tanned my skin and stripped away my softness. My gaze was direct, and strapped to my chest was the impossible proof of my new life. The first person who saw me was old Mrs. Gable, sweeping her porch. Her broom froze. Her jaw dropped. The clatter of it hitting the boards was the first sound to break the midday stupor. Heads turned. A blacksmith's hammer stopped mid-swing. Men outside the saloon straightened up, their smirks fading into stunned confusion. A wave of silence rolled down the street. They stared at me, then at the baby. The whispers started a low hiss. "It's her, Hayes's wife. Look, she has a baby." I ignored them. My focus was the mercantile. I walked with my head held high, my hand resting on Rowan's back. As I reached the center of town, two figures emerged from the saloon, blocking my path. Bartholomew Kane and my husband, Samuel. Kane's face was a thundercloud of fury. The mask of the civilized town boss had slipped, revealing the raw entitlement beneath. My very existence was an act of defiance. Samuel looked like a ghost, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. He stared at me, then at Rowan, and a look of agonizing conflict washed over his face. He saw the woman he'd thrown away, returned from the dead, transformed. And he saw the child, a living symbol of his own failure. "Serafina," he breathed. I met his gaze and felt nothing but a distant, weary pity. "Well, well," Kane boomed, his voice dripping venom. "Look what the buzzards dragged in. We all thought you were dead, Mrs. Hayes." "Your disappointment is noted, Mr. Kane," I replied, my voice steady and clear. It carried in the dead silence. His eyes narrowed, flicking to Rowan. "And what is that? Some kind of souvenir you picked up from your savage lover?" A collective gasp went through the crowd. The insult was public, designed to shame me, to put me back in my place. But his words couldn't touch me. "This," I said, my voice ringing with a strength I didn't know I possessed, "is my son. His name is Rowan." "Your son?" Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't be ridiculous. Everyone knows you're as barren as this desert. You think you can walk in here with some half-breed bastard and call it your own?" Before I could answer, Samuel took a staggering step forward. He wasn't looking at Kane. He was looking at me, at Rowan, with a desperate, pathetic gleam in his eye, a spark of possessiveness. "She's my wife," he declared, his voice trembling but loud. "That child, he's mine now. He'll carry my name, the Hayes name." He saw a chance to reclaim his squandered manhood, to erase his shame by claiming the very symbols of my survival. He was trying to own me again. It was the most pathetic, cowardly thing I had ever seen. I looked from the craven man I had married to the murderer who ran the town. "This child's father and mother are dead," I said, my voice cold as a grave. "They were good people whose path crossed with men far more savage than any warrior I have met." My eyes flicked meaningfully to Kane. The accusation hung in the air, thick and heavy. "Enough of this," Kane snarled, losing control. "You have no place here, woman. You abandoned your husband. This town wants nothing to do with you or your foundling." "I am not here for the town's approval," I stated calmly. "I am here for supplies. I have pelts to trade." "Your way to where?" Kane sneered. "Back to your mud hut? That's no place to raise a child. A decent, God-fearing town is where he belongs. Perhaps with a proper family." The threat was unmistakable. He was going to take Rowan from me. A primal fury rose up in me, cold and absolute. I took a step back, shielding the baby. "You will not touch him," I whispered, and the promise of violence in my voice was so raw, it made even Kane flinch. The crowd was mesmerized. This was not the timid Serafina Hayes they knew. This was a woman forged in fire. Kane saw it too. His usual tactics of shame and intimidation were useless. He was about to order his men forward when Mr. Abernathy, the balding, timid owner of the mercantile, spoke from his doorway. "Let her trade, Bartholomew," he said, his voice quavering but firm. "She's a customer." Kane shot him a look of pure venom, but his spell of authority had been broken. Thwarted, Kane fell silent, his face mottled with rage. I turned my back on him and on Samuel and walked toward the mercantile. The crowd parted for me, their eyes full of a new, bewildering respect. I had walked into the heart of their judgment and had not flinched. The joke was over, and Bartholomew Kane was not laughing. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with tension. I traded my pelts quickly, gathering flour, salt and blankets. Samuel followed me in, pleading, "Sarah, we can start again." With the boy, "There is no we," I cut him off, the finality in my voice like a slammed door. Our conversation ended as the doorway darkened. Bartholomew Kane stood there, flanked by two hired thugs, their rifles held ready. The street outside had scattered. Kane had decided to end this now. "Hand over the boy, Serafina," he snarled, his authority absolute once more. "He'll be raised proper in an orphanage, away from your corrupting influence." My hope waned. I was trapped. Just as one of the thugs reached for me, the town's silence shattered. In a final, desperate act of courage or guilt, Samuel lunged at him, a wild, clumsy tackle that created a moment of pure chaos. I seized it. I grabbed my supplies and ran for my horse. The other thug raised his rifle to my back. A sharp crack echoed from the mercantile porch. Mr. Abnethy, the timid shopkeeper, stood there, a smoking pistol in his hand, a look of terrified resolve on his face. He had chosen a side. Amid the chaos, Kane drew his own pistol, aiming it straight at my heart. But before he could fire, an arrow hissed out of the silence, embedding itself deep in the wooden post inches from his head. It quivered there, a deadly message. On the northern ridge, Cale was visible, a silent guardian, another arrow already notched. The message was unmistakable. Cain's power, challenged by the guilty husband, the decent shopkeeper, and the defiant warrior, had fractured. He stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. In that moment of hesitation, something incredible happened. The women of the town, Mrs. Gable with her broom, the wives who had scorned me, began to emerge from the shops and alleyways. They didn't have guns. They just stood there, forming a silent, human wall between Cain and my escape. My survival, my defiance had lit a spark in them too. They had seen enough of his cruelty. As I leaped onto Bess's back, I pulled the Patterson's journal from my satchel. "You want to know about this child?" I screamed, my voice raw. "Read the truth about how he was orphaned." I threw the journal into the dusty street. It landed at the feet of the townspeople, its pages fluttering open. I galloped out of that town without a backward glance, reuniting with Cale at the creek. We didn't stop. We rode deeper into the wilderness, toward a future we would have to build ourselves. My redemption wasn't about being accepted by the world that had cast me out. It was about building my own. With my child safe in my arms and my true family by my side, we turned toward the setting sun. The wild had not broken me. It had made me whole. The story of Serafina, Cale, and the child born not of blood but of bravery is a testament to the power of the human spirit to forge a family in the most desolate of places. It's a reminder that true savagery often wears a civilized mask, and that redemption isn't found in a town's forgiveness, but in the courage to walk away and write your own ending. They were three castaways who found a home in each other, proving that family isn't what you're born into, but what you're willing to fight for. If this story of survival, prejudice, and the creation of an unlikely family moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story where the underdog doesn't just survive but triumphs on their own terms. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. Your support allows us to keep telling these stories. Thank you for listening.